thank you all so very much for continuing to be with us today for the Encompass Policy Summit. My name is Christopher Shipley. As Jeff Sharp likes to call me, I'm the happiest man in broadband. And we're going to talk today about something that you've heard referenced a couple of times already. We're going to talk about the condo competition, as my boss has affectionately referred to it this morning. We're going to talk about improving access to competitive broadband in MTEs. And I have some wonderful panelists that I am going to introduce momentarily. But before we get started, last year at the Encompass show, we rolled out a very special birthday wish from a very special former chairman of the FCC. And if my colleagues over there are ready, I'd like to play that for you right now, and you'll find out exactly why we're playing this clip.
What an honor it is to be able to wish Encompass a happy 40th birthday. If you're a consumer living in an apartment building looking for a competitive broadband option, Encompass has been your friend. If you're a fiber provider looking to access a utility pole in a cheaper and quicker way to provide competitive access, Encompass has been your friend. I dare say, if you're the chairman of the FCC and you're looking for a thoughtful ally as you seek to reform broadband regulations to give consumers better options, Encompass has been your friend. Congratulations to Chip Pickering, the entire team at Encompass, and to all of Encompass's members for all they have done over the past 40 years to connect Americans. Here's to another great run in the future.
There we go. We really appreciated former Chairman Pai providing us with that video. Given some of the technical snafus that we had earlier today, I'm glad I wrote down exactly what he said, but I wanted to just draw your attention to the very first thing that he talked about with respect to Encompass's advocacy. He said, if you're a consumer living in an apartment building looking for a competitive broadband option, Encompass has been your friend. And we wanted to highlight this for two reasons. First, Encompass has been working on this issue since at least 2017. We had a number of providers come to us and start to let us know about some of these exclusive commercial arrangements that were denying them access. And not just that, but denying them the opportunity to serve customers that were seeking out their broadband service, this faster, more competitive, and more affordable service. And so we've been engaging in this proceeding in each step of the way. Chairman Pai introduced a notice of inquiry in 2017 to address some of these issues. That turned into a 2019 notice of proposed rulemaking. And then in 2021, the Biden administration introduced an executive order on competition that asked the FCC to make this one of the issues that it considered as it looked at ways in which to expand competition across the country. The Chairwoman Rosenworcel, to her great credit, immediately put out a public notice seeking comment and the opportunity to refresh the record on this proceeding. And then just 2 weeks ago, we found out via news release that the FCC was going to be considering this in an item on circulation. And it's our great hope to talk a little bit more about that today and some of the contours of her proposal. Really appreciated, I think, the enthusiasm that I think we saw from this issue from both Commissioner Carr at the beginning of the day and then Chairwoman Rosenworcel in her remarks. I think those are the most extensive remarks I think that she's had an opportunity to give on this particular proceeding. So that is, it's an exciting time, I think, to be talking about this and to be considering this. And we appreciate everyone's attention as we do. The other reason I wanted to highlight Commissioner Pai's video is just to show and highlight how much of a bipartisan issue this really is. Obviously, starting under the Pai administration and now finishing up under the, continuing under the Biden administration, I think you've really started to see, particularly given Commissioner Carr's enthusiasm this morning, a real interest in increasing competition in apartment buildings condos, and particularly in office buildings. So I am very pleased to be joined by three of the leading voices in this proceeding. To my left, we have Jenna Leventoff, who is the Senior Policy Counsel for Public Knowledge. To her left is Brian Regan from the Senior Vice President of Strategy and Chief of Staff from Starry. Brian and I are former Catholic law grads, and I actually had an opportunity to, when I was going to law school, Brian was sat in as a guest lecturer in some of my things. So I'm going to continue to learn from Brian even today. So thrilled that you all are here. On our hybrid panel today also includes Jamie Saloom, who is the Assistant Chief Counsel for the Office of Advocacy with the Small Business Administration. Jamie, can you hear us okay? Jamie, you can hear us, but we can't hear you.
I can hear you.
There it is. We've nailed all of our technical snafus from earlier today. I'm very pleased. Well, let's get started. Brian, I was hoping we could start with you. Starry is a competitor in the broadband market with a large number of subscribers who reside in MTEs. I've checked Starry's website. It's got a wonderful section there for apartment buildings to work with Starry and to partner with Starry. I know that that's one of the successes is the ability to partner with, I think, some of these building owners. I think is a big part of your advocacy. Walk us through some of those successes. Walk us through some of the challenges that you've had in terms of getting access to MTEs.
Sure. Thanks, Chris, and thanks to you and Angie and Chip and the team at INCOMPAS for your leadership on this since 2017. And before that, it's a really important issue. It's impactful in areas in which people live in a high density of MTEs across the country. For those that aren't super familiar with Starry, we are a vertically integrated wireless technology company, network deployer, and network service provider, offering service in 6 cities today with a spectrum footprint that covers about 40 million households nationwide using licensed millimeter wave spectrum. So we're focused primarily on denser parts of markets that do have a higher proportion of MTEs in them. As a result, we spend a lot of time working in MTEs. We're sort of battling these issues in the trenches on a day-to-day basis. And at the outfront, as Chris said, we think about building owners and property managers as partners in as much as we can. I think in most circumstances, building owners and building managers realize the benefits of having competitive broadband access in their buildings. They realize that it is a resident retention strategy, particularly for younger generation folks who are cutting the cord, who care less about having linear video on top of broadband, which is really all they need, that are focused on price and quality over sort of large incumbent services. You know, a couple hundred megs is better than a gig. $50 a month is better than $80 a month. No video is better than having video, right? So I think people tend to understand that and think about property owners as partners in that respect. But the reality is there's a huge structural problem in which incumbents have created this anti-competitive environment. Historically, even though the commission has banned exclusive access agreements in apartment buildings. So once that happened, the incumbents and primarily large cable providers came up with additional strategies to use other kinds of exclusive arrangements to create economic and administrative barriers to accessing MTEs and competing in MTEs to the detriment of the people that live there. So we're super happy that the chairwoman has taken this up, that Chairman Pai before that did as well, that the Biden administration's focused on it, and we think it is a really meaningful way to improve competitive access for millions of people that live in MTEs.
And which of those commercial arrangements, has Starry sort of struggled with the most?
So there are the three that the order apparently does address. So I think probably most nefarious is graduated revenue share. So these are circumstances in which, we are willing to pay a revenue share in a building. We don't love it, but we'll do it. And there are circumstances in which we'll go into a building, we'll say, well, hey, we'll do a revenue share with you. And the building will say, no, thanks. We've got a graduated revenue share. We need even higher penetration to get more revenue out of this deal with the incumbent. So I think that's the worst, and they're going to prohibit that, which is great. Exclusive wiring agreements we see in a lot of places as well, and then exclusive marketing. You combine all these together, you have this sort of package of really just horribly anti-competitive behaviors, and we're super happy the commission is going to take action against it.
Yeah, Jenna, I think one of the things that I really admired about the chairwoman's remarks is she started with consumers and she started with the tenants. PK's looking at this problem from that perspective, the public interest and consumer perspective. Which of the practices that are sort of covered by not the order and declaratory ruling, but even more so the NPRM and the public notice are of the most concern, I think, to PK.
Yeah. I'm gonna hold this thing up so that people can hear me. Microphones don't work with dresses. I need to point that out. I think from public knowledge's perspective, any issue that impacts consumers is an important issue. And so, if there's an agreement and it's leading to what is functionally exclusivity, then that's going to matter to our organization. But, if I have to choose, I agree with Brian. All revenue sharing agreements are problematic because they incentivize a building to not let other providers into the building. But these graduated revenue sharing agreements are particularly problematic because what they do is they say, we can't get the penetration we need if we let anyone else in. And so the building providers keep other people out. It's the way that they can maximize profit. But also these sale leaseback agreements are really problematic because they literally only serve to evade commission rules. The commission has inside wiring rules and they only apply to internet service providers. And so internet service providers try and get around these rules by selling the wires to businesses or to landlords and then leasing them back. And so a loophole like that is problematic just because it's so blatant. It's such a blatant way to evade the rules. I think also, the other one that's maybe less, I don't think it's been mentioned really in any of the NPRMs, but the one that I see the most frequently is bulk billing. A lot of consumers, the problem that they have is that their landlord essentially buys internet for the building and then they pay their landlord for that service. The problem is, one, if a landlord has that agreement, they have almost no incentive to let in another provider. And even if they do, the consumer would have to pay essentially twice if they wanted to get a different provider. They would have to continue to pay the building for the bulk billing provider, and then they would have to pay for the service that they want. So that one's really problematic to me because it's forcing consumers to accept a service that they may or may not want, that may or may not fit their needs.
That's a great point. We talked, about the consumer side of this. Could you talk about the consumer response to this proceeding? I think it's rare that we see a proceeding, with so much public comment in it outside of something high profile like net neutrality. So what does the level of engagement of the public with this proceeding mean?
Last I checked, over 10,000 consumers had actually filed in this docket. 10,000 people across the country engaging with the FCC in a rulemaking docket. Like you said, that's something we haven't really seen since net neutrality. And I think that's because this impacts so many people. I mean, the stats say that about a third of people across the country live in a multi-tenant environment, let alone all of the people that work in one. I'm guessing almost everyone in this room works in a multi-tenant environment. So this impacts huge swaths of the country, and it's extremely frustrating. Like, I know when I first moved to Washington, D.C., as a little baby lawyer, my first apartment that I ever lived in had an exclusive agreement with an internet service provider, and I couldn't get the one that I wanted. At the time, fiber was kind of newer, and I was very excited for fast internet, and I couldn't get it. And I mean, it impacts people. They want what they want when it comes to internet. They need what they need, and they can't get it. And I think that's why we've seen such strong engagement in this proceeding.
Yeah, thanks. Jamie, the Office of Advocacy recently filed a letter in this proceeding on behalf of small businesses. And before I get into the specifics of your letter, I was wondering if you could tell folks a little bit more about the Office of Advocacy in the SBA and about how you sort of balance some of the interests as you conduct your review of some of the proceedings.
Thanks, and thanks for having me here today, Chris. And I'm glad I could join you all, even if it is virtually. And I think that will demonstrate exactly why we got engaged in this proceeding. The Office of Advocacy was created by Congress to represent the views of small businesses in rulemaking proceedings before all the federal agencies. So we're an independent office of SBA. And that said, little disclaimer, our views are not necessarily the views of the administration or the SBA. But on this particular issue, I think the past couple of years have really underscored how broadband is essential for small businesses. It's an absolutely critical input. And that's something that our office has said over the years, but today, I think the business climate is such that without broadband, you're really at a disadvantage in a way that you were not before. Small businesses have had a really tough time over the course of the last 2 years. And I think that broadband should not be an additional impediment for them. So when we saw that the FCC was taking a look at the MTE issue, it got me thinking about small business broadband access in general. And we know that small businesses, about a recent GAO study showed that 2 to 3 million small businesses lack access to broadband at FCC benchmark speeds, much less a choice among broadband providers. So this proceeding was interesting. We know that small businesses largely operate in multi-tenant environments. They have shifted a lot of their employees, about 50% are working remotely, at least part-time. They are using broadband-enabled technology to reach consumers, and it's essential that they have affordable and reliable broadband. So when we started doing outreach on this issue, I think the first person that contacted me was a restaurant owner in New York who rents in a multi-tenant environment, not in a fancy new building, probably in a community where they had fewer choices to begin with, less of an incentive for competitive entry necessarily, potentially. And they were concerned that they didn't have a second broadband provider available to them, because if people were coming into their storefront and conducting a transaction online, they couldn't complete the transactions when their broadband was down. And I think a lot of us have experienced that over the last couple of years working at home. I know I have. I don't have a choice of providers in my own house, even though I'm not in an MTE. So when the internet goes down, business goes down, and right now margins are very, very thin for small businesses. So we wanted to engage on this issue to encourage the FCC to identify where there are barriers to competitive entry in broadband, and see if there are ways to get more broadband to more people.
Yeah, great. And Jamie, I was wondering if you could just, for those that haven't had the benefit of reading SBA's filing, could you just sort of walk folks through the commercial arrangement? I think commercial arrangements that I think, most were of concern to the folks that you talked to, and were of concern, I think, to the Office of Advocacy.
Well, there were 3. I think I would agree with the panelists that revenue sharing agreements seem particularly problematic. Graduated revenue sharing in particular, I think when we looked at the issue, it creates some odd incentives for MTE owners and broadband providers to exclude competitors. And there's not really a case, I think, in the docket for why those should be allowed to continue. But not just graduated revenue sharing agreements. It was also door fees. I think there were comments in the record from smaller providers that said door fees, when set at a certain level, are designed to exclude smaller players. Landlords have an incentive to set those fees at a rate that the highest paying provider will meet.
Yeah. So when we started working on this panel, there was still a lot of question marks about whether or not the commission would be moving forward. I think when we wrote the description for the panel, I think it was, how do we encourage the commission to move forward on this particular proceeding? And here we are. We find ourselves with a press release now, and some comments from the chairwoman announcing that she had circulated an item, a report and order, and a declaratory ruling that would, quote, halt practices that evade long existing FCC rules intended to allow tenants to choose their own provider. The summary indicated that the orders would prohibit graduated and exclusive revenue sharing agreements and require providers to disclose the existence of exclusive marketing agreements to tenants. The declaratory ruling would clarify that sale and leaseback arrangements are prohibited under the commission's existing rules. There's been a lot of discussion at the FCC on this now, but Brian, I'd be curious, what's your company's reaction to that announcement? And then sort of maybe what additional information have you learned about the order that can sort of guide folks' advocacy?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I mean, first and foremost, we're ecstatic that the chairwoman is moving the order. I think, as we've heard, it is a bipartisan issue. Chairman Pai supported it before he left. Chairwoman supports it. The Biden administration supports it. We heard Commissioner Pai and Simonton earlier generally supporting it. So I think we're excited that it's moving. There's a robust record that supports it. The upside, the benefit to consumers is obvious and clear. I think policymakers and consumers have the exact same view on this, which is that you want competitors competing head to head on a level playing field on price and service quality, not using anti-competitive agreements to restrict competition and MTEs or otherwise. So we're super excited it's moving. We hope that it comes out sooner rather than later and gets voted out of the commission, and we can move forward and take action against these agreements. I think probably two areas that need a little bit further exploration. One is, is the decision going to be backwards looking? So if it's only on a prospective basis, that is great and it helps and there's benefit to that, but it's only really going to help at times when access agreements come up for renewal. And those could be terms of 5, 10 years. We're dealing with one right now that has an exclusive wiring agreement associated with it that's into perpetuity, right? So if you're waiting for these agreements to come up before you're actually able to address the issues in them, you're going to have a much smaller and slower impact on the competitive environment in these buildings. And the second is on exclusive marketing. I think we appreciate that there is going to be increased transparency, at least under the order as described. I think we'd like to see the commission take the next step and actually prohibit them outright. I think, as we've seen, you can't trust the incumbents, in particular large cable companies, not to take advantage of every opportunity they have to erect these barriers to entry into MTEs. When the commission prohibited exclusive access, they just figured out the next way to create the same kinds of barriers. And I think that means if exclusive marketing agreements are still in play, you're going to have lots of activity around how you can manipulate and extend the kinds of things that you can do within the context of an exclusive access agreement. So we're hopeful there's still a little bit of opportunity to address both of those things.
And it's interesting, we've to your point about whether or not it applies, proactively or retroactively. I think one of the things that we've come to understand is that things like exclusive marketing agreements can sometimes last 7 to 10 years. And so, in situations where there's already one of those in place or one of these other commercial agreements in place, not applying the provisions to pre-existing agreements would just delay competition at least that long in some of those places. Jenna, same question to you. What's public knowledge's reaction been to the announcement? What additional information have you learned?
Our reaction was that this was a really great first step. It's an important thing to do to start to get competition into multi-tenant environments. But I don't think it goes far enough. And so we're really looking forward to having a full FCC with reinstated Title II protections, where the FCC can actually go so far as to ban all agreements that function as exclusive agreements. Because I think the reality is that providers and landlords are going to keep finding ways to manipulate the rules. If we create rules that prevent action between landlords and internet service providers, maybe they'll sell the wires to the next door gas station. and in that way, they'll continue to evade the rules. They're just going to keep coming up with new loopholes. And so we would really like to see the commission ban any agreement that has the impact of creating something that's exclusive. And I think you hit on a good point about exclusive marketing agreements. We've actually heard a lot of anecdotal evidence that building managers, they'll read an exclusive marketing agreement and think that it's just an exclusive agreement, period. Because they may not be lawyers, they're risk adverse. Why would they want to risk letting in a new consumer if they can just kind of fall back on a misreading of their exclusive marketing agreement? So I think also having the commission go the step further to ban those would also be helpful, but that would be included within, banning anything that has the function of creating exclusivity in a multi-tenant environment.
Yeah.
And to that point, it is something we actually experience all the time. Our salespeople go into a building that has an exclusive marketing agreement, and the building manager is under the impression, and perhaps they've been told by the salesperson from the incumbent that, hey, this is an exclusive access agreement. You can't let anyone else in. And it's gone so far as we get like cease and desist letters from incumbents about being in a building, right? Just physically being there to try to sell service within inside the building. They're not going to sue the building owner, right? They're going to go after the party that they think is ultimately.
Certainly.
competing with them.
Yeah. Jamie, I know that just by advocating at the FCC, I think the Office of Advocacy has probably said its piece. But just wanted to get your reaction, I think, to the announcement and to the chairwoman's proposals.
No, I think we were delighted to see that the FCC was taking this up and considering how to move forward on this issue. I think as they move forward, it's going to be important that they look at the comments from small businesses, including small broadband providers and small business consumers, and see what barriers really exist, to look at the docket very closely, to look at the record and continue to engage with stakeholders on this issue.
We've got just a couple of minutes left. I wanted to ask two more questions. Jenna, let me start with you. In the commission's press release, the agency expressed concern that the practices in the proceeding could throttle consumer access to providers participating in the commission's affordable broadband programs, like the new affordable connectivity program. How, in your opinion, how do these practices, practices and agreements put consumers' participation in the ACP at risk?
I think there's two different ways that it would put it at risk. So the first thing to remember is that with the Affordable Connectivity Program, which is a $30 broadband subsidy for low-income consumers that Congress passed in the most recent infrastructure package, and the FCC just put out rules for, it's a voluntary program. So providers don't have to participate in the ACP. And so if you're living in a multi-tenant environment where there's only one provider and that provider does not participate, a consumer is out of luck. They can't get that benefit. I think the other way that it can impact participation is competition lowers prices, monopolies raise prices. And so with this $30 benefit, I think, like I said, most consumers are getting $30 here. Some consumers, if they live on tribal lands or in a high cost area, although that hasn't been defined yet, they'll get $75. But for the majority of consumers, they're going to be getting a $30 subsidy. And the internet in a monopoly building is likely to be higher than $30. And so consumers will have to pay the difference. But the studies showed that a low-income consumer can afford to spend about $10 a month. And so they might not be able to make up that difference. The other thing that really comes into play here that, I think a lot of us are lucky enough to not recognize is that low-income consumers, a lot of them don't have the means by which to pay a copay. They don't have a bank account. They don't have a credit card. And so even if the copay was 1 penny, they wouldn't have the means by which to pay it. And so if a consumer is faced with, hey, I can get this subsidy, but I'm going to have a copay and I physically cannot pay the copay, they're not going to take advantage of the benefit. And so I think until we get competition into all of these buildings, we're going to see a lot of people that are eligible for the benefit not take it up because they just can't.
Last question here, and looks like we got quick answers only, I believe. 30 minutes, always flies by. In our advocacy, we've been encouraging the commission to include a further notice of proposed rulemaking in the item. As we look into the future, what issues does the commission need to make sure it's continuing to examine and monitor to ensure that tenants, small businesses have sufficient broadband options? Brian?
I think one thing we raised in our comments maybe a year or two ago in the last round about this was the quality of the wiring in the building itself, and that there's an opportunity to get building owners together with providers to figure out ways to improve the quality of the wiring in buildings through new construction or through upgrades to existing construction so that you do have fiber all the way to the unit. And sometimes a provider can pay for that. Sometimes groups of providers can pay for that. Sometimes the real estate developer can pay for it. But figuring out ways to create incentives to have fiber go all the way down to the unit, I think is an interesting part of this that should be thought about over the long term, because you've got buildings, for example, in Boston that have twisted pair copper that's wrapped in cloth, and you're trying to provide gigabit service or twisted pair copper. You're not going to do it, right? So that's going to be the next barrier in this ultimately over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah. Jenna?
I think I said my piece already is we would like the FCC to start thinking more broadly about this and to limit anything that could, create an exclusive agreement in a multi-tenant environment, and to have that definition keep evolving, because we're always going to get new practices that can limit competition, and we want to make sure the policy keeps up with that.
Sure, and one thing I'll say, we certainly want to make sure that the commission continues to consider as many commercial opportunities as residential. Jamie, last word. As you look into the future on this issue, what does the commission need to continue to examine as it considers broad competition in MTEs, condo competition?
Well, I'll just be really quick here, but I think it's worth mentioning that the government's about to make huge investments in broadband. And we want to make sure that when that money is spent, that the rules that the FCC has in place encourage competition and don't foreclose competitive entry in places where there may not be a competitive case to enter right now, but there might be in the future as a community's needs evolve. So we want to make sure that the investment is, I think, as someone else said earlier today, future-proof.
Well said. Well, will you all please join me in thanking our panelists, Jenna, Brian, and Jamie. Appreciate everyone's time today. Thank you.